Welcome back, everyone. This is the second video in the database querying training series. If you're new and this is your first time, would you mind stand and briefly introducing yourself? Just give us your name, where you work, and what you do with SQL Server and how long you've been using it. Wait, I don't think that'll work after all. Give me your name anyway, though. Let me go ahead and put it on the roll. All right, thank you. It's good to have you with us today. All right, in this session, we're going to discuss the SQL tools, the tools that a database administrator and database developer use quite frequently. Specifically, we're going to have an introduction to what an instance is, since that's a kind of a foundational term and a foundational topic that we're going to need as we're talking through how the tools that an administrator or developer uses. And we're also going to talk about a server and a database and how those kind of fit together. Then we'll talk about Management Studio, SSMS. It's kind of the workhorse tool for most of the work that we're doing, and it'll also be the tool that we're going to use throughout the rest of this training series. And then we'll conclude with a brief discussion about books online and how you can use it to get additional help on topics that you want to research and know about SQL Server. This session is intended to give you kind of the information and foundation you need to use the tools that we're going to use throughout the training series so that we can kind of be on a common foundation. Everybody's starting off on the right foot. First, let's talk about an instance. Okay, when you install SQL Server, you install what's called an instance of SQL Server. It's a standalone independent copy of SQL Server that resides on a piece of hardware, or I guess a piece of software if you're using virtualization. But think of it as a program that's installed on a machine. Now, when you install SQL Server, it's kind of like installing your antivirus software. Once you install it, you don't have to open it up, you don't have to tell what files to look at. It runs in the background and it gets its job done. SQL Server runs the same way. It's installed as a service on the box, and when the machine starts up, it starts to run, and it waits for you to give it some instructions, command to bring back some data or to add some data from the database. And it's always running there in the background, waiting for you to tell it what you need it to get done. Now, you can install more than one copy of SQL Server on a box, just like you can install more than one copy of an antivirus program. Maybe you can install Norton and McAfee and Kaspersky and some of the other industry leaders as well. They don't have to be this, and when you install SQL Server, it doesn't even have to be the same edition or version of SQL Server. You can install a copy of SQL Server 2012 on the same box that you already have a copy of SQL Server 2008, and also a copy of SQL Server 2005. And they'll all run together and play nicely. In fact, they'll play a lot more nicely than if you installed more than one copy of your antivirus software. Now, naturally, when you install more than one copy of SQL Server on a box, each one takes up a little bit of memory and a little bit of CPU and a little bit of hard drive space. So as you install more and more copies of SQL Server, you'll find that the resources you have available on your server start to become a little more scarce. But as long as you have a beefy enough box, it'll run fine, and it's quite common to do. Now, each instance of SQL Server that you install has its own name, and you connect to it by using that name. Let's look at some examples here. Let's assume that I have a server, and the name of the server is C. Crawford. On that server, I install two copies of SQL Server. One I give the name of website, and the other one I don't give a name. When you install SQL Server and you don't provide it with a name, then it installs what's called a default instance. And you refer to that instance of SQL Server just by using the name of the machine, as I've shown here. Now, when you give SQL Server a name, then you refer to it by the name of the machine, and then a backslash, and then the name that you've given it. In this case, I've given it the name of website, and so I would refer to it as ccrawford/website. And that's how I would connect to it. Each of these instances of SQL Server are independent from each other. So the C. Crawford instance is going to have its own set of databases, and the website instance is going to have its own set of databases. The database here that I've called out with the name of sales is going to belong to one of the two instances, but not to both. So as you look at the hierarchy here, you have a server that has one or more instances on it, and each of those instances are independent, can have their own settings. And within each instance, you have a set of databases. The databases are independent of each other, but reside on a specific instance. So you can kind of see that there's a one-to-many relationship as we go down through here. Now, if you have more than one database on a server, those databases are going to share some common settings at the instance level as far as memory usage and some common instance objects. But within each database, they're going to have their own object. Here I've called out order header as a name of the table. Each database will have its own set of tables, store procedures, functions, a whole slew of different objects that we'll talk about as we go through the training series. So as you come down the hierarchy, each of these has many of the objects below it. The objects share in common features and objects from the level above it, but are independent as they go down. Now the reason that this is important is that we need to know the difference between an instance and a database. Oftentimes people come up and say, hey, I can't connect up to the database. And what they really mean is, I can't connect to the instance. And that's a completely different question and a completely different problem. So it's important to understand, not only do you have more than one instance on a box, but you have more than one database on an instance. And when you connect, you're connecting up to the instance. And we'll actually see how this works with multiple instances when we get to the demo a little later in this session. Okay, let's talk for just a second about Management Studio. Management Studio is a client application. It's important to differentiate between the Management Studio client application and the SQL Server Windows service. Kind of as I've diagrammed here, Management Studio is going to be an application that runs on your desktop or your laptop. This is what you're going to the program you're going to fire up, and you're going to type SQL commands or navigate through objects using Management Studio. Now, Management Studio isn't SQL Server though. SQL Server is a Windows service, and it's going to be running on your server. I got kind of a picture here of a rack, and I realize that the bottom part of this rack is really a network switch, but SQL Server is going to run on the server hardware, which is not necessarily the same place that Management Studio is running. What Management Studio does is it's really an interface into SQL Server and on top of the language that SQL Server understands. So Management Studio will take the commands that you type or the actions that you take, it will interpret it and send it to SQL Server. SQL Server will then do a piece of work, either running a query or modifying data or whatever it is, the command that you send it. It will perform the work, and then it will send a result back to Management Studio. Management Studio will then take that result and display it and present it back to you in an intuitive way that you understand what work has been done. So another way to think of these two applications here, the separation, is that SQL Server is really the workhorse, and it's doing the heavy lifting. It's doing the actual work. And what Management Studio is doing is it's really doing the presentation. It's making it look pretty and making it easy for you to interface with SQL Server. The reason I draw the difference between these two is sometimes you'll have somebody come up to you and say, hey, my Management Studio is running slow. And that's probably not what they really mean. What they probably mean is, I'm using Management Studio to connect to SQL Server, and SQL Server is running slow. All right, let's go ahead and look at a demo here. I'm going to go ahead and fire up Management Studio. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and connect to a server here. It's called C Crawford 8. You go ahead and type my password. My login is Chad. I don't need the 1 here on the end. Go ahead and type my password. Okay, the first thing you'll notice is this section over here on the left-hand side. This is what's called the Object Explorer. And this is where you can get a really nice graphical view of everything that's in your database, or on your instance, excuse me. I need to be careful, don't I, about the terms I use. Everything that's on your instance. Here at the top, it gives me the name of the instance that I've connected to, the version of SQL Server, and the name that I've used to connect up to the instance. Now, here I have a series of folders where Management Studio has organized all of the objects that are on the instance for me. So I have a list of databases. If I expand this, I can see the databases that are on my server. We got 4 of them. And there's a folder here for security, for server objects, replication objects, always on high availability objects, management, and then integration service catalogs and the SQL Server agent, which I don't have turned on right now. We're going to spend most of our time in this training series looking at these objects here under the database folder. So let's spend a little bit more time there and take a look. As I expand out into a database, it shows me the items in every database. As you remember, each database has their own set of these items. The tables that are going to be in the AdventureWorks database are different than the tables in the Benchmarks 2008 database are different than the tables that will be in the 2012 database. And again, those are going to be different than the tables that are in the PIT Restore database. So we're kind of drilling in to see the specifics for each of these. Let's focus on the 2012 one here. As we expand tables, we get a list of tables. Let's collapse that. If we open up programmability, we can get a list of stored procedures. Likewise, we can look at functions, we can look at assemblies, we can look at storage and security objects. Let's go back and look at tables for just a second. As we expand out here, I'm going to pick a table here. Let's look at the employee table. If I click plus there, I can see what the contents of that table are. Not necessarily the data that's there, but the structure. I can get a list of the columns, the keys, the constraints, any triggers, indexes that are on the table, and statistics that have been generated on the data. Now all of this we're going to talk about in later sessions, so I'm not going to go into it too much detail here, but know that there's a way here to drill in and actually get more information about the objects in your database and see it. Another nice feature that it has is I can actually right-click on the table and select the design option. That'll bring up a designer in this right-hand pane where I can very easily make changes to the names, data types, knowability, and other column properties in the table. This puts it in a graphical kind of view. Now, later in the training series, we're going to talk about how to create and modify tables, and we're going to talk about the SQL statements that we execute to make those changes. Again, Management Studio is a client application. This is not the server itself. When I make changes here to change the name of a column or to change some of its properties or to create a new table, see, Management Studio is going to take the work that I've done in the graphical interface and convert it into SQL statements. And that's what will get sent to SQL Server. When SQL Server replies back, Management Studio is going to present that in a way, graphical, nice, easy to understand graphical way here. But Management Studio didn't actually do the work itself. It just acts as the conduit to get the information back to SQL Server. Now another thing that I want to show here is how to connect to more than one instance. So here I have the C. Crawford instance. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this connect here to connect to another database engine that's on the same server. And this one is the website. I'm going to use the same username and password. So now I'm connected to two servers at the same time. You can see that each one has its own set of databases, and they're different. And inside each database, they have their own set of tables. Now, Object Explorer here allows me to connect to as many databases as I need to, database instances, must be careful, that I need to, and work with them all here in this pane. Now, if I want to write a query against a database, I can do that by clicking the New Query button here. That will open up a pane here on the right-hand side where I can type a query. And you can see here that Management Studio is actually doing something very nice for me. It's actually trying to help me with my typing. It says, I noticed you type HUM. Do you mean, are you looking for the Human Resources schema? I can highlight it, hit Tab, and say, yep, that's it. And then it says, oh, which table in that schema are you looking for? We'll talk again in another session about tables and schemas and what they mean. The SQL Server here is using autocomplete to try to help me find the tables and the data that I want. That's a pretty nice feature. Now, it doesn't always work perfectly. If you've just created an object, it takes a minute to refresh, or you have to force it to refresh its cache so that it knows about objects. And sometimes it'll guess a little bit wrong and think that you're trying to autocomplete when you really don't. But it's a fairly nice feature that works pretty well most of the time. Once I have my query written, I can click the Execute button, and Management Studio will send that query to SQL Server and then bring the results back. So here it's given me all of the rows and all of the columns out of the employee table. It's very nice. The results are right here in this grid format. Now, if I had typed something wrong, perhaps I messed up the name of a column. I was trying to type a where clause for the business entity ID, but instead of typing the business entity ID correctly, I misspelled it. I left out the Y. SQL Server would try to help me out here using the red underscore squiggly. Usually that means you've got a spelling error. In this case, it's SQL Server trying to tell you, oh look, I've noticed that something here that I don't quite understand. If you highlight over, it'll tell you invalid column name, business ent ID, and it'll kind of give you a clue that maybe there's something wrong you need to go fix. And again, it doesn't always guess correctly. There'll be times when you have something typed perfectly and that Management Studio here is doing the underlying, not SQL Server. But when you send the command to SQL Server, it processes perfectly. SQL Server knows how to do it. Management Studio just wasn't able to tell that it was written correctly. So it's not necessarily foolproof, but it is a nice feature that will help you every once in a while find an error in a large query. But otherwise, you'd have to spend quite a bit of time sifting through to locate. Now here my results came back in a grid format. As you'd expect, you can actually highlight part of this grid and copy and paste it into another program, something like maybe Excel, to do some further processing. You can either just drag and highlight, or you can hit this square here in the corner to highlight the entire set, all of the rows and columns. When you want to copy, you have a right-click option to copy just the data, or to copy the data with the headers. And when you select this option, the headers that are here across the top will compose the first row of the data that you're sending to the clipboard. This works really well when you're trying to export data into Excel and you want to have the top row in your Excel sheet have all the header names and information, because it'll take that information with it and put it into Excel for you. Now, if you don't want your results to come back in a grid, you have several other options. And these are controlled by these buttons up here at the top. Right now, the results to grid is the option that was selected. We could also say that we wanted the results to come back as text. Let's give that a try. Let me take this where clause off so we get a set of data. Now our results came back into text format. If we scroll back up to the top here, you can see that SQL Server has put it in a column delimited format where all of the data has come back and it's just in straight plain text. The other option that we have here is to send the results to a file. When we click that and run the execute, SQL Server will actually prompt us for the location and name of the file that we want to save. I like the results to grid, so I'm going to go back to that format. If you need additional real estate, because right now half our page is for our query and half is for the results. If you need additional real estate, you can always come and hide the results pane so that you have more real estate to actually type your query. Now, in addition to sending the results back to you and displaying the results that SQL Server has processed in a nice graphical format here for you, Management Studio has a second tab here for messages from SQL Server. Typically, it'll tell you how many rows were affected by the command you just did, and I have an option that we're going to talk about later in this session that also returns information about the number of logical and physical reads. This gives me a little bit of information about what the disk impact was of the query that I executed, and it's a piece that I've turned on by default. And when we get to the options in Management Studio, I'll show you how I did that. Another option that you have on the query is right here. This button will include the execution plan with the results when they come back. With this option selected and a query executed, there's a third tab that appears. This tab will give us information about how SQL Server used its internal resources to process the query. These become very important when you're looking at optimizing a query or figuring out why a query is running slower than what you would expect. Now, this query plan is not necessarily very interesting, so let's add a piece here. We run the query with this join and look at our execution plan. We can see it now has a little bit of branching and some additional structures. As you write queries that are more complex and a little larger, these query plans will become a lot more interesting and a lot more complex. This is one of the first places you want to go when you're looking to optimize a query, is to see how SQL Server is performing this query. As we get into the later sessions, we'll have an opportunity to dig into these query plans a little bit more and understand what each of these objects, each of these elements here mean. All right. Now, one of the ways that SQL Server helps you when you're writing your queries is to provide you with a quick way of getting information about these tables, or not getting information about the tables, but getting the table information into your query. If I wanted to write another join here against another table, Maybe I want to include the employee pay history information. I can actually take and drag from my Object Explorer and drop in the query pane. And SQL Server will pull out that information for me. Now all I need to do to complete my join is to grab the other tables. See, I don't want to drag that one out. I'm going to copy from here just to get the table name. Now I can also take and I can expand out here, and I can drag the column that I want as well and add it in. It will pull out the name. Since the name's the same, I could drag it from that table, but let's keep this all legitimate and drag from the right table. Okay, so there I can drag and drop the columns directly out of the object pane and drop them into my query pane. In addition, if you're looking for maybe a list of all of the columns in this particular table, you can actually drag the column header folder out and drop it on the query pane, and it will bring you all of the column names for that folder. That's kind of a neat shortcut way of getting a lot of information into your query pane really quick. If I wanted to get more information about the employee table, one of the ways that I could do it is by opening up all of these folders and looking at each of these one at a time to get the information I needed. Another way to do it is using a stored procedure that's built into SQL Server called SP-help. SP-help gives us information about an object. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to highlight just a section of what's on my screen. I'm going to highlight just the one line. When I hit execute, Management Studio is going to only send this one command to SQL Server, not the whole set. Let's look at that. So SP-help executed, and it returns several different tables here at the bottom for me to look at. First one here has information about the table and the time it was created. The second one has information about column names. That's a little bit more detailed than what's here on the side here. It includes the collation, so the precision and scale information. It also tells me whether or not there's an identity defined on the table, if there's a row GUID column, what data file group the data is located on, indexes, constraints, there we go, indexes, constraints, tables that are referenced, the foreign key, and the views that are referencing this table. So this SP-help is a really nice stored procedure that gives us some information about structures inside our database. Now, one feature that Management Studio has included is we can actually highlight the name of an object, and then using Alt F1, Management Studio will provide the SP-help information for us. This is a little shorthand we can actually use. We don't actually have to type out the stored procedure. We can just highlight what we're interested in, use Alt F1, and the SP-help information shows up down here below. And if you take a look at what Management Studio is actually sending to SQL Server, what it's done is it's taken the piece that you've highlighted, pre-painted SP-help to it, and then sent it. So it's actually doing exactly the same thing here with the highlight Alt F1 as it is here with the exec SP-help. Management Studio just has built into it this nice feature that it'll do that for you automatically just by highlighting a specific row. So that's an important differentiation there between SQL Server, the service running, and Management Studio, the client app. The client app has that ability. SQL Server doesn't know that the Management Studio has done that for you. It can't tell the difference between this execution here and this one here where I hit Alt F1 without the space at the beginning. There we go, Alt F1. It doesn't know that there's any difference between the two. Now, one thing that I showed you before was if you highlight just a specific section and then hit execute, that it executes just that one piece. The difference here is if I had nothing highlighted and I hit execute, it would do both. Oh, ambiguous column name. Let me go back to star. Here I have my query from the top, and then starts the SP execute. So by using highlighting, you can have SQL Server execute just part of what you have in your window, one part at a time. I think for the rest of the demo, what I'm going to do is, instead of clicking the execute button up here, I've kind of gotten the habit of using F5 as an execute. That's an alternate here. You can see that the highlight up there shows that F5 is also execute. So you probably won't see me click the execute button anymore. I'm going to be using the F5 on my keyboard. Let's look at some of the configuration that you can do for SQL Server. If you come here to the options in the tools drop down, there's quite a few things that you can change the way Management Studio works. The first one here in the environment, you can actually change the fonts and colors and the way it highlights where you have a bookmark or a breakpoint. I've left those pretty much the same, but if you want to change the colors that are being used, this is the place that you can do it. Some of the places that are interesting to look at are here with the query results. When you look at some of the options for SQL Server, you can change the amount of characters that are retrieved for XML and non-XML data. What that does is tell Management Studio, when you get a column that has text in it, I don't want to retrieve any more than a certain amount of data and display it here. It kind of keeps the resources used under control and limits what shows up in the screen down below. Here I've got mine maxed out to where I've got the most amount of data that I can get. The reason for that is when I'm copying and pasting out of this window, I want to make sure that I get all of it. The maximum for Management Studio here is 65,000 characters. So if I have a column that has more than that, and I cut and paste out, the data that I'm getting is truncated. I can use one of the other methods to get data out of SQL Server other than results to grid and get more data out if I have very large text fields and I want to make sure that I've captured all of it. Same with results to text. Here I have the minimum set a lot lower, and the reason for that is when you have it coming in text and it goes way off to the side, out over to the right, it's really hard to read and use. So I have my limit here set a little bit lower. You can set it to whatever it is that you want. What I recommend is you set the value for the way you typically work with SQL Server, whether it's I need all of the data or I need to be able to see all of my data at once, which means you'd want the columns to be smaller so you can see more on the screen. And then as you have a need, you make an individual exception, change it, and then change it back to what you typically need. Let's look at the query execution options here for SQL Server. Here on the Advanced tab and the ANSI tab are some settings that are applied when you first connect up to a SQL Server. Here's where I have the Set Statistics I/O on. This option is the one that I set in order to get the information back about about the disk I/O, the logical reads and the physical reads. This is one that I like to set so that I know how SQL Server is accessing the disk for the query that I just executed. If you have some of these other settings that you want to set, they're here, and these will be applied automatically whenever you connect up to a SQL Server. In all of these cases, you can turn them on or off by executing a command inside the query window, so they're not set permanently. Or if you want to change the default, you can come in here and set them as well. One fun thing that I want to show here on the General tab is the batch separator. Those of you who have worked with SQL Server before will be familiar with the go command. Go separates a large number of queries into individual batches. Let's take, for example, a query pane that you have here. Here I've got 2 different queries, but let's imagine you had maybe 100 queries, and you wanted to group them into sets that were sent to SQL Server as an autonomous group. I want these 10 statements to be sent to SQL Server at once, have it process them. Once those are done, I want the next 10 to be sent. And then I want the next 10 to be sent. I don't want it to send all 100 all at once. I want to send them in groups of 10. When each is finished, the next one is sent to the server. Well, the way you do that is by putting the word go, in between each of those 10 queries. And Management Studio will package those 10 queries up, send it to SQL Server as one group, and then it will wait for the results to come back, and then it will send the next group to SQL Server. And the word go is what tells Management Studio that there's a division here between these 2 queries. Now, as you can kind of tell here, it's kind of inferred by the word go being here in the options section of Management Studio. Go is actually a feature of Management Studio. If you go out to the help file for SQL Server and search for Go, you won't find it there. SQL Server doesn't have a concept of Go. It doesn't know what the word Go means. Management Studio, however, does. Typing Go in Management Studio means that Management Studio will do that work for you, but it doesn't send the word Go back to SQL Server. So if you wanted to change the separator from Go to something else, maybe new batch, you could. And now, if I clicked OK here, Go would be a command that Management Studio would just send to SQL Server, and SQL Server, of course, would crash, doesn't know what Go means. But whenever I type the word new batch, Management Studio would break the set of queries there and send the queries above the new batch word to SQL Server. And once that finished, it would send the queries below the new batch word to SQL Server. So you can actually change it from Go to some other phrase if you have a need to. What I don't recommend is you change it to something that's a reserved SQL Server keyword, like maybe select. If you did this, which is a very mean April Fool's joke, if you changed the batch separator to be select, then every time Management Studio saw the word select, it would assume that that was the beginning of a new batch. And it wouldn't send the word select to SQL Server. It would send the queries before it to SQL Server, then the queries after it to SQL Server. I have to admit that I did this once to a friend of mine, and it was a lot of fun, but I do not recommend that you do this at home. So the batch separator Go is actually a Management Studio feature and not a SQL Server command. All right, now over here on the left-hand side in the Object Explorer, we've connected to more than one server. If we wanted to have another query window where we were querying out of the sporting goods table, we could do that. Now we can see we have two tabs up here. We can go back and forth between each one. This one here on the left is connected to sporting goods. You can see up here, not only does it say sporting goods as the name of the database that we're connected to here, but down here on the bottom, it has information about the connection for this window here as well. I'm connected up to the website database. It is SQL Server 2012 RTM. I'm connected as Chad to the sporting goods database. My last query ran in 0 seconds and returned 0 rows. If I switch over to my AdventureWorks connection, you can see here that the name of the instance is different. I'm just connected to the 2012 database. My last query still ran really fast, such that it didn't show any time and the number of rows. And this works really well, but tabbing back and forth can be kind of awkward, particularly when you have many tabs here going across the top. What you can do is right-click on the tab itself and select a new horizontal or vertical tab group. That will allow you to see the results of more than one query at the same time. You can continue doing this as many times as you want until you run out of screen real estate, allowing you to have multiple tab groups, and look at the query results in a very easy to see format. Now within each tab group, you can again have multiple tabs as well. So as you can see here, I'm opening up more than one window here, and I can go back and forth between the windows. When there's not enough space to fit all the tabs, you can still access them using this drop-down, and you can get to each of the query windows that you need within that tab group. So this is kind of a nice feature that allows you to work with multiple windows all at the same time. Okay, let's talk for just a minute about Books Online. Books Online is the help file for SQL Server. As with most programs, you can highlight a word that you're interested in, hit the F1 key, and it will bring up help for that item. Here I've highlighted select, and it gives me some information about how to write a select statement. Okay. Now, with Books Online, there's a contents pane, which allows me to dig in to topics using kind of a tree format, where I can drill in to get more specific information as I get more and more refined what I'm looking for. So here I've drilled into the database features and into tables. Here I can get information about how to create a table, how to delete tables, how to change column order in a table. And with each one, it gives me a little bit of information, links to other related topics. And typically down at the bottom, you have an example on how to use the statement or a feature that you're looking at. There's also an index tab here where you can type a little bit of information about what you're trying to find and go drill directly to it. If you know that you're looking for syntax on create procedure, you can go directly there. You can also save favorites, and you can do a search through the help documentation if you don't want to spin through the index or use the contents drill in. Now, this is Microsoft Help that I have installed locally. By default, when you install SQL Server, it doesn't install the SQL Server Books Online local to your machine. You need to go out and download it and install it in order to have it local. It's nice to have it local because you get that highlight F1 capability to go directly into the help. But there are some disadvantages to having it locally, and that's that it doesn't get updated unless you specifically go out and update the content. If you want to have your content be completely current, then you need to use the Books Online actually online on the internet. You can get to the Books Online from the MSDN website. From here, you go to their library, and you can drill in to their server information, picking the release. And here you go. Now we're into the Books Online, actually online, as we drill into the database engine features. You see that this is the exact same structure that we had before. In fact, here's the same Create Tables article that we're looking at. Now, this one will be updated. If they need to make any changes to the Create Table topic, they'll make it here. They'll also update the help file, but you'd have to go out and download it again to get the most recent changes. Another advantage of doing this online is you can actually very quickly switch between versions. If you want to see, this is the Create Tables topic for 2012, but if you're interested in seeing what it looked like in 2005, you can actually go and very quickly change to the 2005 version, and now we're using the 2005 Books Online. So that's a really nice feature that you can get there. Let's go back to our presentation now. As you're going through the rest of this training series, it's going to be important for us to be on the same page. As I'm doing a demo or an example, it's going to be specific to 2012. And it's going to be specific to the way that I installed SQL Server and the features that I have enabled. Where there's common differences, I'll try to point those out. But you have two ways to follow along yourself. One is you can either do it yourself. You can go ahead and install a copy of SQL Server, and what we're going to use for most of our demos and examples is the AdventureWorks database. This is a database that Microsoft has created as kind of a sample database for us to use. So we're going to be using that because it's somewhat ubiquitous and common. It's easy to get a hold of. So you can either install SQL Server yourself and go ahead and attach the AdventureWorks database, or you can use a VM that I have created. It uses VMware's VM Player, and this VM will put everybody on a common stable platform. I've already installed the operating system, I've already installed SQL Server, I've already installed the AdventureWorks database. Using the VM will ensure that what you're seeing is going to be very similar to what's going to be in the demo, and everyone in the class will be on the same platform. It also means you don't have to go through the work and trouble of getting SQL Server installed. Now, the advantage of using the VM is that it's going to be fairly easy. You copy the file over and start it up. The advantage of doing it yourself and installing SQL Server outside of the VM is you don't have the overhead of a VM running on your machine. That may be something that's important to you. So to help you with whichever direction you want to go, one of the next sessions is going to be how to do a basic, simple SQL Server install and how to get and attach the AdventureWorks database. I think I'll take a minute to talk about getting the Books Online local as well, so you have that option too. So if you want to do it yourself and you haven't installed SQL Server before, I suggest you watch that session and take an opportunity to kind of maybe follow along while you're doing your install with the videos so that you can have that will be on the same page and will be your environment will be similar to the one that you see in the demos in the training series. If you don't want to do that, you can use the VM and take advantage of the SQL Server install that I've already done for you. You can go ahead and grab a copy of the VM and know that you're ready and good to go. And then you can go ahead and skip the session, the video where we go through the install. All right, if you have any questions about the SQL tools or any other items that we've discussed in this session, you're welcome to contact me. Either stop by my desk and I can answer your question in person, or send me an email, or send me a short note on Twitter. and I'll reply to you that way as well. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next session.